people in the room, so this is great. Welcome to the NSGIC for the Nation. This is our 3F interest group meeting. We always try to hold every quarterly, but we always try to align with the annual meeting. And today we will be getting a USGS update from Sue Buto, the 3F elevation data acquisition lead. We have the discussion question, which you've already should have seen earlier. And then as time permits, we'll check in with you all to see what your 3DEP news is. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing, Sue, and give you the slides.
Sounds good. So I have just a few brief slides and then we'll slide right into that question. Can you all see my, that first slide?
Yep.
Yes.
It's always a mystery in Zoom. It feels like you can't see a darn thing. So not a ton of updates. I do want to do a quick update on the status of FY20 acquisition. You can see from the status map here, the orange areas are the BAA awards for FY20, 26 awarded projects in 17 states. The bright green areas are areas that were other acquisitions, largely federal partnerships put together for data acquisition. And we are now at about 74% of the nation as of September 2020. We'll update that figure and get a final figure sometime early in the beginning of the federal fiscal year, which is coming up next week, shockingly. You can see the total funding or the total acquisition is around 106 million this year, a bit down from previous years, but that's a little bit to be expected. We didn't have big supplemental projects this year, so still respectable, let's just say that. Good news, we have been waiting for approvals for the FY21 broad agency announcement, and we have approval to release that. That hasn't been officially released on sam.gov and grants.gov yet. We'll keep you posted, and I'll post on the NSGIC community as soon as it does go live. I anticipate that that will happen before the beginning of the fiscal year, again on 10/1. Proposals will be due, mark this on your calendar, November 13th, 2020 at 5 p.m. Eastern time. So that'll be the deadline for proposals. And we're asking folks that if you have a need for an IGCE for your project to estimate project costs, you can get those into us by October 16th so that there's plenty of time for our contracts folks or our commercial partnership team to get that information out to you. All that documentation will be obviously posted on SAM and grants.gov, but also on our broad agency announcement portal. We've been working on revising the BAA web pages. So if you go to the URL there, usgs.gov/3dep/BAA, that'll be your entry point to all kinds of resources for the BAA, including the links to SAM and grant.gov and links to application materials as soon as we get those posted, as well as a newly redesigned FAQ webpage that's much more easily accessible than previous that were held in Word documents and kind of hard to find. There's also a recording of the instructional webinar on the BAA that we gave on August 19th, so you can revisit that information as needed. It's all recorded and available for you. So, and as always, questions to BAA, please go to gs_BAA@usgs.gov. Another quick update, I think I posted this on the NSGIC community. The latest version of the LiDAR base spec has been approved and is now version 2020 Rev A, and you'll note that there is a pretty substantial naming convention change in this update. We are doing that so that it's easier to pin the year of the update and to allow us to have potentially more frequent updates. I will say we've not come to a place where we know how frequent updates will happen. We're still having discussions there. But we do want to make it a little easier to understand sort of where we are in an update phase, partly with the naming convention. And you can keep an eye on upcoming revisions in there's a revision status page now that'll give you an idea of what's on deck for revisions. And you can access all that from the URL that's below this image here. Oh, went one too far. So what I want to do is tee up our discussion question real quick. We're sort of revisiting a couple of the slides that Vicki Lucas presented to us yesterday, and that is this sort of newly baked or still in the oven analysis and an update of the way that we are thinking about the cost to complete 3-depth coverage. As I noted, we're about 74% of the nation at the end of FY20, and we have some challenging ground to cover going forward, as many of you know. So we're looking at this now in a model sense, as opposed to just assuming sort of a straight cost for QL2, a straight cost for QL1, understanding that some areas are maybe more challenging to collect, and some areas and some partners and stakeholders have specific QL needs and other specific needs that can increase the cost to collect. So Allison Jason has been working on developing a model to help us maybe get at a more refined look at what the cost to complete is. And you can see a lot of the model inputs here. I'll say that we're not completely done yet in considering what model inputs might go into this effort, including not yet including specific state plan information where we know, for instance, the state has standardized on a need for QL1 data. We've not yet incorporated that, so keep in mind as we have this conversation. So the idea here is that this becomes a tool for high-level planning. And in this map, you can see that cost, or the sort of difficulty level model that Allison put together and clustered into $5 million groupings based on hydrologic units. They're the HUC 12s, then aggregated up into these roughly $5 million bundles or clusters of land area that has yet to be complete. And so we're thinking of these as sort of almost example projects that give you an idea of or give us an ability to have sort of project ready areas for ballpark estimates when there are funding opportunities that arise to us, in some cases like supplementals. So we're also sort of playing around with the idea of almost an adopt-a-block concept, like, you know, interest in a particular block of area. But we have to keep aware when we're thinking in those terms that those blocks are a moving target, right? So as we get into FY21 and we develop the FY21 acquisition plan between federal priorities and partnerships and the BAA projects, obviously those projects nibble away at these blocks and we have to revise the blocks. So they're not a static thing, they're a moving target as we think about these things. And again, I'll remind folks as we go into the discussion that these blocks and this model will be further refined, but ultimately we want to share this on our 3-depth by the numbers website, which you can get at the URL listed here, usgs.gov/3depth/numbers, which gives you a feel for the gap and our funding gap and the cost to complete numbers going forward. So with that, Linda opened her slide up with the discussion question, which is what strategies can be employed to focus resources on areas for which 3-depth has yet to be collected. So what are the sort of innovative ways or strategies we can approach the remaining 25-ish% of the nation that needs to be covered.
Sue, this is Phil. I have a quick question.
Hmm?
Are federal lands and state and private lands part of this blocking, or is it an attribute of those blocks?
Yes, and Allison can probably speak most in most detailed about the model, but we have taken into account in particular specific, there it goes, specific stakeholder needs in particular. So for instance, understanding that Forest Service has very specific acquisition requirements, such as QL1, often leaf on, 50% side lap. And so we took into account those kinds of needs over Forest Service lands and applied sort of a cost factor, if that's the correct term, Allison, to use for that.
Basically, yes.
Yeah. Does that answer your question, Phil?
Partially. In those blocks, are they all one flavor, or are they, can a block be, say, state land and federal land? From an ownership standpoint, I'm just.
Yes, in these aggregations, they could be some combination of many things, different land cover types in the model, different stakeholders or landowners, different difficulty levels, including things like slope and canopy cover. So it's a pretty complex model. So any of these $5 million aggregations are an aggregation of many inputs.
Okay.
And it's based on land management, so it's not necessarily ownership. So if Forest Service is managing it for a state, then it would show up in their, you know how data can be. We all know how data can be. It should show up in their land management holdings, but we didn't do a separate, if it was a state forest managed by a state, it would have gotten a more difficult rating just because it's a forest, especially if it was evergreen, but it might not have gotten the side lap requirement. Since that's a Forest Service specific one in the model, the way it's set right now.
Cool. Well, this is, I think, awesome. This is great. I assume these will also be available as REST services to consume?
I can't answer that to the affirmative, to be honest with you.
We probably have to talk about that.
Well, it would be really nice to have this, because when states are doing their plans, they can call this up as a reference.
Yeah, we'll have to discuss that. And again, I will say, I think it would be beneficial to as we get a little closer to refinement on this model, to have a discussion about the model inputs and get some feedback from the 3DEP interest group with respect to state specific, in particular, thoughts and needs on these models. Like I say, we still have a little bit of room to change, or we have needs. We know there's things that aren't necessarily incorporated in the model yet that we've discussed.
This is Shayna, and I have two questions. Have the state liaisons had inputs into this? Because for Illinois, we've got questions about 4 counties where the data that we do have meets the specs, but the DEMs do not. So USGS is working with us when they get some staff allocation to remedy those. So that information doesn't seem to be trickling through on this map. And then my other question is, when will funding from the upcoming federal fiscal year affect this map? Because we've been told from our NRCS contacts that half of our remaining counties are going to be funded by them this upcoming year. They've committed the money already. As long as there's no freeze to the federal budget, it's already there. So that also doesn't seem to be on this version yet, which is kind of separate from the whole state plan question that you had brought forward. So those were my 2 questions. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Shayna. I'll say that this is a snapshot of what 3DEP looks like as of the end of fiscal year 20. So we don't sort of project too far ahead until a project is awarded and funded. We don't want to get ahead of our skis, basically, when it comes to those projects. So we do understand that there are projects either in the works that we are pretty confident are going to happen this year, but until the task order gets awarded, we generally don't count our chickens, if that makes sense to you. And that goes to the comment that I made earlier, that these are moving targets, so we can't think of them as static blocks, right? Because Illinois, NRCS funds the rest of Illinois next fiscal year, and all that information in Illinois changes as soon as that task order is awarded and we know that project's in place. So we have to think of these when we start to talk about strategies to focus resources in these areas. Again, we have to keep in mind there's always a moving target going forward.
Yeah, it was just those two in process kind of, in the next 2 months questions, not, oh, we think we might,
Yeah.
those kind of things.
Yeah. If it helps, we don't know exactly how often we're going to update this model. I think it's part of the conversation about how often we would need to have something like this adjust. But we typically update the 3DEP by the numbers page when we have actuals at the end of a fiscal year, when we get an actual budget, and when we get a president's budget. So it's usually about 3 times a year that we update the page, and it's possible that we would then update these at the same time. I don't know. We haven't quite made that decision yet.
We've got a question in the chat from Jim. Do you want to go ahead and say something?
Who, me? So the question, what strategies can be employed? Are we looking for new strategies, or, I mean, we all have our state plans that we're trying to work from, which are kind of an old strategy. I guess I'm just a little confused of what are we looking for? Are we trying to figure out how to get rid of that, what is it, $161 million funding gap?
Jim,
Yeah.
so you can, I would like to finish up with questions to Sue. Sorry, Jim, I should have read your question more carefully. Questions to Sue and Allison on their presentation before we get into the discussion question. My fault, I told you to say something. Any other questions for Sue as far as the BAA or the new specs or their bundling? All right, let's get back to the discussion questions. I think Sue was going to respond to your question about strategies. Is that correct, Sue?
Yes, and I'll say all of the above, Jim. I mean, if we need to maybe get some feedback, are there different strategies that we should be thinking about? Are there different ways we should be thinking about? Are there partners perhaps that we're missing in our strategies to move forward? And I'll use this year's project that grew seemingly out of nothing in Nevada as an example. We had not necessarily thought of Department of Energy as a partner in 3DEP. And this year, in coordination with USGS Earth Mineral Resources Initiative, who really helped us put together a coordinated effort with the Department of Energy Geothermal Technologies Office, we were able to pull in NRCS interests and BLM interests and knock out a pretty substantial piece of Nevada this year in again, a partnership that I don't think had been top of mind for a lot of folks previously. So thinking about, Rachel, thank you, yay, Nevada. So just thinking in those terms, like, are there partnerships that we're missing? Are we thinking about, for instance, Western lands? I know folks turn to BLM and say, well, the Western lands are largely, not entirely, but largely BLM managed lands. But are there other interests we should be considering, and unique interests, rather than just looking at the federal land interest? Those kinds of new thinking maybe is where we're going with this
Yeah,
question.
and just to add to that, this is Vicki. You know, we have different things show up in our budgets, and we have lots of stakeholders, like you saw on the 3DEP coalition list out there communicating, you know, with their delegations. And, you know, for instance, the last couple of years, we've had a Great Lakes increase in our budget to collect data for the Great Lakes region. And so there, you know, part of this is to, you know, help any of the communications that others want to do. If they have a, you know, area or region of interest, you know, this may help them understand what the costs are and may be able to communicate more effectively about their areas of interest. We've also in the past had a Chesapeake Bay increase that we've had for a few years, that we've been collecting data in the Chesapeake. So, you know, it's just to kind of help enable those communications as another part of a strategy. And yes, we want to complete the coverage. I mean, this is all about just let's complete the national baseline coverage.
So the last time we all got together, Linda getting us together, we did talk a little bit about the BRIC funding from FEMA, and Wisconsin and Minnesota talked to our state hazard mitigation officers, and pretty much figured out that that wasn't an option this year. There's a category called capability and something building, capacity building, and we thought, oh great, we'll just ask for millions of dollars there. Turns out that the millions of dollars is only for sort of brick and mortar hazard mitigation projects, and the sort of planning things weren't included in that this year. But the message that we left with our hazard mitigation folks was, please tell FEMA to you know, include that next year when they assign the BRIC money. And they you know, they said that was certainly possible to communicate that message. So that's what we heard this time along. And I'm just wondering if anybody has run into, you know, talk to their state hazard mitigation officers and learned anything different.
Jim, this is Phil. I have some concerns that your state folks are not yet familiar with the new BRIC program enough to say no, unless they have specifically spoke with the federal managers of BRIC. I wouldn't rule that out yet, because that was surely not the initial presentation of BRIC. You know, that's the hazard mitigation funds that have previously been available have been very selective. This was presented as something, you know, bigger, better, new, improved. So
yeah, I agree, Phil. I think they've sort of revised their instructions. We had an early version from our state hazard mitigation officer that said basically that, and she had to recant that after talking to him. We did have a FEMA person on our call, so she didn't you know, say that.
This is Shayna, and I had a call this morning with our sister survey, the water survey, and the people that would be involved in that. And it wasn't about FEMA BRIC, but it was with them and Ken Hinterlong of FEMA about a LIDAR related question. And in the process of their studies where they do field work, they do land survey in the floodplains, they do flood modeling, and then they go to communities, and they have this many multi-year process. A new rule has come up somewhere in FEMA that if you're base elevation / terrain data is more than 10 years old and new data comes out that supersedes it, you'd be expected to use it. But since their study window is like 5 to 7 years long, they've got studies that are coming out. They're almost done. They're ready to be released for public review, but we've got new LiDAR data coming in that's newer than that, or breaking that 10-year window, and they're all freaking out because it would then I forget the term, but cancel out some of their studies before they can even release it right when they're releasing it to the public. And they kicked it around. They're going to look at it more, but they might modify their recommendation for LiDAR 10 years or better to something like 15 years or better or 20 years or better, just because the time gap was so disjointed. So they're going to push that discussion up to more regional or even national FEMA audience. So that's what I know about FEMA and LiDAR. And they would be the people I talked to about BRIC. That didn't come up specifically, but it might be part of the mix that they're considering as they're changing their requirements.
Well, Jamie and I have been working on getting some new contacts within the BRIC program, and we're planning to still follow up next week with that after the conference, and we'll report back if we can confirm what Wisconsin is saying, and or what other, what we're trying to get a national perspective on this, so we can advise and inform states as to how they might be able to do this. I know internally in our state, I talked to our Department of Natural Resources who works with FEMA, and they've got really strict guidelines and rules, and it's very, very complicated, and they had no clue. They still don't as to what they may or may not do. So anyway, we'll be following up on it.
Let's get back. I know Joanne had a question about participation by the National Park Service. I'm not sure if we really have a solution here, but Sue, is there something you can comment on? She asked, national parks have been something Washington struggled with. I'd like to brainstorm how to get them on board or other strategies for those areas.
Can you repeat that, Linda? I missed what you said.
Certainly. Joanne, would you like to express your question?
Sure. It's just that as we're looking at different areas, and when I'm looking at the map regarding Washington, we definitely
I'm
have
sorry, Joanne, you're really, really quiet. If you can get closer to the mic, maybe.
Oh.
There you are.
Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. Basically, our holes, some of our gaps, and actually I didn't quite see it in the map that you showed there as much, but like all our two major national parks are definitely gaps, and it's just been a struggle to get the 3DEP over them. So I was just trying to figure out what are other techniques. Like, I'm definitely interested in thinking outside the box, and so I just wasn't sure if there's some other strategies we could use to get them to play.
It's a good question. I mean, Park Service is one of our 3DEP working group and executive forum members, and they do participate to the extent that they can with funding. Obviously, there's always funding struggles. I will say that I just had a conversation with our national map liaison for Washington and Oregon, Tom Carlson, and he's been talking with Brandon Lemire, who is our 3DEP working group member for the Park Service, specifically about Washington. I think particularly Olympic is going to be a
Yes.
challenge.
That's a challenge in a lot of ways.
Right.
Just the topography and everything else.
Exactly. When you think about the canopy cover in Olympic, it's going to be a bit of a challenge. So Park Service has come to us with funding to the extent possible. I'll say that Yellowstone was on our FY20 collection list this year, and they are, the park will be collected this fiscal year.
Oh, fantastic.
Or was funded this fiscal year. And it was a consortium of USGS and Park Service funding, as well as USGS Natural Hazards Mission Area funding. So it takes sort of a consortium of folks to do that collection.
And Sue, I would also add, you know, like the example of, I think it was Yosemite, where the park had funding to collect LiDAR that was from a conservancy. So, you know, if there are, you know, conservancy type groups that are associated with the parks, they might be also another source of funding that, you know, maybe we don't often think of. So I don't know if you have anything like that in Washington, but that might be, you know, so groups that you might be able to, you know, come to with, you know, potential partnership.
I don't think they're quite as involved as that one seems to have been. We've reached out to a couple friends of parks kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
But
yeah, the Yosemite Conservancy is both active and relatively more able to fund things like that than most of the others that I've had some kind of chat with.
Mm-hmm.
This is Erin from Montana. I can talk a little. I don't think Karen's on the line, but I think I would just recommend finding a local contact at the park. And we just kind of prodded and poked, and Karen and I had both kind of been watching what was going on with Yellowstone, and you know, eventually we had invited them to our working group meetings, and eventually just kind of, you know, they're like, okay, we've got the money. And so I would just continue that coordination and find that local person, because they do want the LiDAR. It's just a matter of them finding the funds, and then sometimes they kind of come up quickly. So that would be my recommendation.
Well, and I like Susan's idea too of how can it be some sort of consortium, but I think if you can kind of push them or help them, and I know Tom has been working on our behalf very diligently too to try to get those. So I appreciate all of that. I just think it's going to take something like that, I think, to help.
I could give you the contact for Yellowstone and Glacier too, if you want to see if they have any insight.
Sure, it wouldn't hurt. Thank you. Appreciate it.
So I just want to confirm for my notes, you said Yosemite is going to be covered this year, correct?
Yosemite was covered a couple of years ago, I think,
Oh.
a year or so ago. But Yellowstone is active this year,
Okay.
as part of Glacier, to bring Erin back into the conversation. Not the entirety of Glacier, but a good portion of it this year as part of the BAA award.
Right, we're very grateful for that. Thank you.
Well, we love our parks, right? So, and I think that does highlight, I mean, that in most cases, it does take a consortium of some sort. And so being as innovative as you can and reaching out to as many potential partners as possible tends to do get you farther, for sure. But I like Erin's idea to reach out directly to the park itself as well.
Dan, you had an interesting question about engagement with the private sector. Would you like to share that?
Sure, just getting off mute. I'm just curious, as you know, we always have these conversations between government, but is there, and maybe you're expecting that to happen at the state level, but should we be having some national conversations with our utilities companies and things like that? You know, I almost feel like we could encourage them to even participate in the 3DEP project that's going on here with NSGIC, Linda, to open up that conversation a little bit and get more voices at the table to at least be aware of what's going on and what we're trying to do. And I don't know, I think private companies use the data for sure. They should certainly be at the table and helping us try to fund it, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think that, you know, that would be great. And I think outreach to utilities is worth doing. I would just say that, you know, in our travels over the years, we've seen that they're pretty much proprietary about their data. And if they are collecting data, they don't want to share it, you know, similar to like timber companies. So just, you know, that's what we've seen. But if there's a way to, you know, get them to join in the community, that would be great.
I'll say, Vicki, I noticed Rachel Mykander, fellow Nevadan, I think said something about has anybody partnered with mining companies, and I think that's a similar issue with mining companies. I mean, we'd be interested in partnering with them, you know, in areas where they have interest, but it seems like often they're interested in proprietary information and not putting it out in the public sector or the public for public consumption in the same way we are. But it's certainly worth looking at.
Yeah, so on that front, California got approached about an idea for public-private partnership that would have involved the collection of data to a much higher point density as a portion of the private component, with a downsampled version of it that's consistent with QL1 being then available through the 3DEP and related programs.
Mm-hmm.
So there's possibilities there. We're just not finding right now the budget to cover a state share of that.
Nate?
Yeah, Nate, I would.
Go ahead.
Sorry, Linda. That's what happened for Arizona, Nate. We were approached by a private entity, and I guess the project is about to be kicked off, but that's exactly what's happening. It's being collected at a much higher density, and the 3DEP portion of it is equivalent downsample to QL1. So it's really been very helpful for Arizona. We got a big chunk.
Yeah, we have a large number of folks that have within the state and within some of the other local groups that have said that's an awesome opportunity, but our budget's dry.
To make sure I'm capturing this correctly, Nate, if I'm understanding you said you were approached by private sector to contribute resources to improve the data quality, but you couldn't come up with a state funding component of the project.
Yeah, and this is one of those ones that is a darn crying shame right now. We were actually approached by, and in this case it was Sanborn, as a broker for two private entities that were each interested in contributing the equivalent of 20% of QL1 costs, so a total of 40%, managing a partnership through the 3DEP program, which could have supplemented that further, with the balance needing to come from the state or other local sources. And I have hit up most everybody that I can think of, my contacts through state agencies, both Environmental Protection Agency, Caltrans, or the Transportation, Natural Resources Agency, which includes both fish and wildlife, water, and fire, as well as our own Department of Conservation that's home to the Geological Survey. And kind of across the board, the answer that's being pushed down from the governor's office is basically we know that this is important. We recognize the intersection with current events, but we're dry.
So if I can just quickly say, with the Arizona project, I mean, we're very interested in seeing the data from that project before we sort of leap model going forward, because it is Geiger mode data, and it's our LiDAR-based specification. It's written for linear mode data, and so at this point we can only say that we assume that the downsample data will meet 3DEP, but we don't 100% know for sure.
So
So until we see the data from Arizona, we're cautiously optimistic.
Okay. And if I may take that next step, you wouldn't want California, you wouldn't be enthusiastic about California jumping in big on it.
I think we should consider cautious movement forward. And as you know, you're saying that you don't have the state budget, which is completely understandable given current circumstances. I think piloting and going small and not committing to an entire state collection of Geiger mode data when we don't really 100% know if that's going to really meet the needs. So I think we should move cautiously. It's promising, but we need to be careful.
That said, and I'll hush up after this. We are definitely not planning on letting any of our current emergencies go to waste in our requests for moving forward, because there have been enormous demands on our existing LiDAR collections, amazing cooperation with people, with groups that have recently collected and making emergency versions of it available, and it's being noticed. So I'm expecting that we will get significant traction out of this. And others of you that may have similar, though I hope less severe issues, it will likely serve you in good stead as well.
Well, and the other thing I think to think about as we think about the Arizona data as compared to, say, you know, the Sierra portion of California or other potentially heavily vegetated areas, different vegetated landscapes, different landscapes. So we need to consider that with respect to what sensor is really the right thing to use. So I think we just need to make sure that we're not thinking about a one size fits all either. I mean, the Maricopa data could be amazing, right? Because that's mostly over the urban area of Phoenix. Is that correct, Jenna?
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Sue. The terrain is really forgiving, where it's pretty flat. It's all urban. There isn't a lot of rural area in the footprint in the AOI that we're collecting, and I think your point is well made. You know, if the results prove to be what we think they will, it will be exciting, but we don't know yet.
I agree. I think it's a really exciting project. Then again, you know, and particularly in California's instance or any other instance, we need to take the terrain and the vegetation and a lot of other things into. We all know there's no one size fits all answer. Unfortunately, it'd be so much easier, right?
Right?
Yes, it would be, and thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Nate. We appreciate all your efforts for sure.
On the various reads for either specialty pursuits or for...
I'm sorry, Dave. Oh, could you hear that, Sue?
No, couldn't hear it.
David, we had a little trouble here, and you want to try again? David Holm?
We lost him.
We lost him.
I had thought that might actually have been an accidental bleed through from something else going on.
Okay. Sorry.
I'm not sure.
Okay.
Sure sounded official, though.
It's probably the best thing ever said, right?
That's right.
And we totally missed it.
That's right.
So in sort of wrapping up the discussion here, we are at 1:47. We need to back up. Yeah, I think we will wrap the discussion there. I have captured the chat. I'll put that, make that available to everybody in case there's something that you wanted to follow up with somebody. And we'll just use these last couple minutes to do a round robin to see what's your 3DEP news. Does anybody have anything they'd like to share with the group? And as far as successes, challenges, just general activities?
This is Erin from Montana. I guess I would love to hear any kind of successes with getting local partners, because we are still having a lot of difficulty finding local partners. And so if it weren't for the feds, we probably wouldn't have much flown for Montana. So any insight you could provide, that would be very welcome.
This is Neil. I'll jump in and just tell you who I've worked with, and if any of that turns out to be something you haven't thought of, then it might be useful. So partners either for imagery or LiDAR in the past, you'll, I think, be aware of NRCS, the state office. Currently in conversations with a regional planning agency that happens to have some grant funding that they think they could push toward my, as yet, the LiDAR proposal I'm trying to put together. Our state environmental agency, our state transportation, both have been regular partners. I actually had a good conversation with a nonprofit foundation. They ended up not deciding to put money toward the LiDAR project, but it was clearly something that they've thought about. So let's see, who else have I worked with? Yeah, those are the ones that immediately come to mind. So I'm not sure any of that's useful, but there it is.
I'll just hop in and say that's at least the second time we've heard the nonprofit foundation idea come up, and it's something I think we should keep in mind that, you know, there's potentially folks out there. Nature Conservancy comes to mind, and there are others, right?
Those of you in the chat, feel free to chime in as well.
Yeah, this is Frank. I just added something to the chat, but you know, many of our executives at high levels that are kind of out of the details and don't really maybe not appreciate the level of coordination we have going on now would benefit and would maybe breathe a sigh of relief and give us even more support if we run this up the flagpole as compliance to the GDA. This is exactly, this kind of coordination is exactly what the GDA is intended. But maybe folks are wondering, like, how are we complying with that thing? And oh yeah, we forgot about that. All right, better keep going because it's the law, not just a great thing to do.
That is a good point, and we are trying to communicate about 3DEP as the GDA reporting and all that starts to spin up. This is a good point.
Jim, you made a note that Wisconsin uses local partners for 50% of the match, but if I understand you correctly, you feel like, as I understand it, you feel like that resource has been a bit exhausted?
Yeah, we're getting there. They have to be willing partners, so it depends on their willingness to participate. But they do have a yearly source of income, which is our land information program, which is real estate fees that are tacked on top of that go to GIS stuff. So they're the richest ones in Wisconsin by far.
Mike, you want to bring up your question about wilderness areas?
Yeah, so those states that have large wilderness areas, and again, this is me just thinking out loud here, but are there any possible partnerships with travel organizations, adventure organizations, perhaps even state organizations that, you know, push travel and those types of things? I know we've got a huge amount of wilderness land here, and if you look at the map that was shown earlier, a large chunk of it hasn't been done. So all these sports people that go out there, and you know, if you're looking for opportunities to for people who have a vested interest in those areas, that might be a possible avenue. like I said, just thinking out loud might be naive, but you know, any money's good money at this point.
Yeah, exactly. And I like that that's a combination of both your state areas, federal areas, and your private sector corporations. Well, I just looked at the time. It's 1:54. I want to thank you all for participating. We'll get the slides out. We'll get the chat out. And always, it's just, I look forward to this meeting because I look forward to talking with the entire community and getting input. And I think it just makes us all a little better, stronger, faster, and gets us more 3-depth data. So thank you all.